Blackwood Boys Novella 4, Part 2, Life in the Sprawl. Step 1, The Well and the Work. Fall, the first month. The house on the alley had a well, and the well had bodies in it. They found out on the second morning when Damien lowered a bucket for the water he'd been so pleased about and hauled up something that was not water. He looked at what was caught on the bucket's edge for a long moment, set it down very carefully, and walked across the courtyard to where Ego was prying rotten boards off a window. "Ego," he said, "don't drink from the well." It took the rest of the day. They rigged a harness from their pack straps and rope bought deer at the second-hand market. And because George was the lightest and the least troubled by dark places, George went down. He was quiet on the way down, quiet at the bottom, and quiet when he called up. Just 2 words, flat as slate. 3 old, 3 bodies. Not the Hallows work, or not recent work anyway. These were older than the squatters, wrapped in rotted cloth, weighted with broken brick, dropped down into the dark by someone who had wanted them forgotten. George tied the rope around them one at a time, and the boys above hauled, and by dusk 3 shapes lay in the courtyard weeds under the grey autumn sky, and nobody wanted to look at them very long. "We should tell someone," Ewan said, without much conviction. Bones laughed, sitting on the well's lip with his flask. "Tell who? The watch doesn't come out here except in numbers, and when they do come, they don't come to help. You tell the watch there's dead men in your well, boy, and by supper the story is that you put them there." He took a drink. "In the sprawl, you bury your own problems. Everyone does. That's why the ground out here is so rich." So they buried them. There was no priest and no words anyone knew to say, so they dug 3 graves along the courtyard's southern wall, laid the strangers in, and set old flagstones over them, fitted flat, so that within a week the graves looked like nothing but paving, and within a month the boys walked over them without thinking. All except George. George never walked over them. He went around, every time, without seeming to notice he did it. The way a man steps around a sleeping dog, and sometimes in the evening the others would see him standing at the southern wall, with his head tilted, listening to something. "Are they loud?" Damien asked him once, half joking, half not. George considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "They were," he said. "They're quieter now. I think they like the stones." And he went inside, leaving Damien standing in the courtyard with his skin prickling. 6 dogs pressed suddenly close around his legs. The money went the way money goes. They sat down on the 3rd night with every coin they had left, laid out on a board by firelight. Bannock crowns and clipped coppers, and the last few coins of northern silver the money changers hadn't yet devoured. And they made the kind of list poor people make, where every item on it is necessary and half of them must wait anyway. The door came first. No argument there. Ego had put an axe through the old one himself, and a house in the sprawl with a broken door was an invitation written in letters even the illiterate could read. They hired a carpenter from 3 lanes over, a stooped man named Weck with sawdust in his eyebrows, who sucked his teeth at the frame and charged them more than it was worth, and did honest work all the same. The new doors were ugly, thick planks, iron-strapped, crossbarred on the inside, with a beam it took 2 boys to lift. They were the most beautiful thing any of them had ever owned. The well got a cover and a new windlass. The great kitchen fireplace got its chimney swept and its cracked throat patched by a mason who worked with a pipe clamped in his teeth, and never once asked what a pack of northern boys was doing in a house that had lately belonged to squatters. In the sprawl, nobody asked. That was the first rule George learned, and he learned it fast. Out here, a question costs more than an answer. The windows on the ground floor got boards and shutters. The windows above got nothing, because the money was gone. "Spring," Ego said, looking up at the gaping second floor with his jaw set. "We'll do the rest in spring." "You said that about the roof," Ewan said. "The roof can also hear me say spring." Ego went to find Mott, the Erie's man, on the 8th day. It meant the bronze gates, the great choke point in the open wall where the sprawl's thousands funneled through into the city proper each dawn. Workers and porters and barrowmen, all of them shuffling past the green-cloaked watch under the cold morning shadow of the wall. Ego had no papers. What he had was Mott's name, And it turned out that in the river market, that was paper enough. Mott came to the gate himself, vouched for Ego with a bloody handprint on a labourer's chit, and clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to stagger a smaller man. "Blackdown," the butcher said, grinning. "Knew you'd come. The hometown always comes back for the hometown. That's the whole of the North in one sentence, lad." The work was brutal and simple, and Ego was good at it. Carcasses came off the river barges by the hundredweight, and someone had to haul them, split them, break them down to the joints and cuts the city's cookshops wanted, and do it fast in the cold, all day. Ego hauled and split and broke. He didn't complain, didn't slow, and didn't talk more than he had to, and within a fortnight, Mott was giving him the work two men had done before. Within a month, he was giving him something else. There was a man on the river stalls called Herrick, who ran 3 barrows and thought that made him a lord. And Herrick's boys had a habit of leaning on the smaller stallholders. A knocked-over table here, a spoiled tub of fish there, a copper or two for the promise it wouldn't happen again. One grey morning, 2 of them decided Mott's new northern boy looked like he needed teaching, and crowded him at the barge ramp, with the particular smiles of men who had done this many times and never once been surprised. Ego put the first one in the river and the second one on the ground, and did it so fast and so quietly, and then simply went back to work, that by noon the whole market had heard 3 different versions of the story, and all of them were better than the truth. Mott said nothing about it directly, but that evening he loaded a sack with offcuts and marrow bones and half a mutton shoulder and shoved it into Ego's arms. "For the house," he said gruffly, "and them dogs of yours. Can't have Blackdown dogs going hungry in my city. Wouldn't be right." And so it began. Ego coming home each evening through the bronze gates with meat on his shoulder, and the dogs learning the sound of his boots in the alley 3 corners before he arrived. And for the first time since Blackdown burned, the Blackwood boys going to sleep with full bellies more nights than not. George found his own work in his own way, which is to say that nobody ever quite saw it happen. One week he was simply George, quiet, watchful, wandering the lanes around the house learning their turnings. The next week, somehow, he was carrying messages. A word from a stallholder in the Lost and Found to her sister in the rag market. A folded paper from a moneylender to a man who owed him. A parcel, contents unasked, from one side of the quarter to the other. The Sprawl had no post and no papers, and so it ran on runners, and it turned out the runners' unofficial guild had exactly one requirement, that you get there, get back, and keep your mouth shut in between. George might have been built for it by design. He was fast, he was forgettable when he wanted to be, and he had a map growing in his head that no one else in the family could have understood, because George's map had layers. The first layer was streets, which lanes cut through, which dead-ended, which flooded when it rained, which belonged to which gang and cost what to cross. The second layer was people, whose word was good, whose stall was a front, which watched sergeants along the wall that took coin and which took pleasure in not taking it. And under those, the third layer, the one he didn't talk about. The Sprawl was old ground wearing new rags, and George felt the old ground through his boot soles everywhere he ran. There was a corner near the tanneries where 3 lanes met and no one ever built. Though space was gold out here, and the locals couldn't say why they didn't, only that they didn't. George knew why. There was something under that corner, sleeping, and the lanes bent around its dreams. There was a dry fountain in the eastern quarter that had been a shrine before it was a fountain, and was still a shrine underneath, and the old women who left crusts on its rim in passing, for the birds, they said, were paying rent to something older than the Duke's whole line. There were ghost roads where the dead walked on certain nights, and the living, without ever agreeing to it, left those lanes empty after dark. George ran his messages and learned the streets and learned what was under the streets and said nothing to anyone. But he started carrying bread crusts in his pocket and leaving them on the fountain's rim when he passed. It seemed polite. Bones took the second floor. There were 4 rooms up there with sound floors, and the old man claimed the 2 facing the alley, and over the space of 3 weeks, between drinks and sometimes during them, he assembled the bones of a practice. A table sturdy enough to hold a screaming man. Shelves, basins, his battered roll of instruments, cleaned and oiled and laid out in an order he defended with genuine fury the one time Ewan reorganized them. Jars that slowly filled with the herbs and powders and evil-smelling spirits that Ewan was sent out to hunt through the markets and hills. A doctor in the Sprawl, Bones said, surveying the rooms with his flask in hand, is either a saint or a butcher, and they pay the butcher better. We shall aim for something in between. Which are you? Ewan asked. Retired, said Bones, and drank. But he wasn't, quite. Word moved through the lanes the way word did, and the sick began to arrive. A crushed hand from the brickyards, a child with the croup, a knife wound, its owner declined to explain. Bones took them all, charged what they could pay, which was sometimes coppers and sometimes eggs and sometimes nothing, and worked on them with those trembling, sure hands while Ewan held basins and threaded needles and watched everything. You're not watching, you're learning, Bones accused him one night, after a bad berth in the next lane over that had ended. Against all odds, well, I can feel it. It's like being pickpocketed. Should I stop? Bones was quiet a moment, wiping his hands, suddenly and unusually sober. No, he said, no, boy. You keep learning. Take everything I have. It's the only thing I own that's worth stealing. It was the errands for Bones that brought Ewan to the Lost and Found, and the Lost and Found brought him to Fiver. The Lost and Found was the nearest of the daily second-hand markets, a sprawling maze of stalls and blankets and barrows where everything the city above had lost, discarded, or been relieved of eventually washed up for sale. Ewan went there hunting the impossible lists Bones gave him: hen's foot root, a glass vessel with a narrow neck, any book with anatomy in it that hasn't been used to start fires. And it was the book hunt that led him, on a drizzling grey morning, to a stall unlike the others. It was neat. That was the first strange thing. Everything on it was sorted, priced, and clean. And behind it sat a slight man of unguessable age, with a sharp, pleasant face and quick, pale eyes, wrapped in a good coat, watching the market flow past him the way a heron watches a stream. Anatomy, the man repeated, when Ewan asked. Now there's a word you don't hear at the Lost and Found. Physician's boy, are you? Apprentice, Ewan said, and then, because the pale eyes seemed to expect more, my master's setting up a practice. Red, the alley off the wall, East Quarter. I know it. The man said it simply, the way other men said good morning, and somehow it was more unsettling than a threat would have been. He extended a thin hand. Fivelston Dornies. The market calls me Fiver, and the market, as usual, has the right of it. He turned, without hurry, and drew from the shelves behind him a small battered book bound in cracked leather and laid it on the stall. Ewan opened it, and his breath caught. Diagrams, careful ones. The body opened like a map. I can't afford this, he said honestly. No, Fiver agreed, pleasant as ever. But you can earn it. I've a parcel wants carrying to the rag market by noon, and my usual boy has a broken toe he acquired through stupidity. Carry it there, bring me back what they give you, and the book is yours at a price you can afford. The pale eyes glinted. Consider it an introduction. I like to know the useful people in a quarter, and a doctor's boy is a useful person. Ewan carried the parcel. He never learned what was in it, and understood without being told that not learning was part of the wage. And when he came back, the book cost him 1 silver and 2 copper bits, a tenth its real cost. And Fiver had another small job, and then another, and that was how it started. So gently and so gradually that Ewan never afterward could name the day he had begun working for Fivelston Dornies, only that by winter he was. He learned in pieces that Fiver's boys were everywhere, runners and stall-minders and watchers, boys of 8 and men of 20, in every market of the Sprawl and, it was whispered, inside the walls too, in the city proper, where no Sprawl trader should have been able to reach. What Fiver actually traded, under the second-hand goods, no one could say. What he wanted, no one could say. Whether he was a small man who looked large in the gloom, or a very large man indeed who was careful to look small, no one could say that either. He's fair, was all the other boys would tell Ewan. He's fair, and he doesn't forget anything. Ever. It was on the 4th or 5th job that he met Toll. They were paired to carry a crate between them across 3 market quarters, and the other boy hooked his end up with a grin and talked the entire way, a running, cheerful commentary on every lane, stall, gang mark, and shortcut they passed, delivered in the fast, flat accent of the deep sprawl. Ptolemy, he introduced himself, walking backward through a crowd he somehow never touched. Toll, if you're a friend and you carry your end level, so you're a friend. Mind the gutter there. That's Wexy's pitch. Don't look at his apples, he hates it. You're one of the new ones off the North Road. The house with the dogs, yes? Everyone knows. Everyone knows everything, only most people know it wrong. I know it right. That's the difference between me and the sprawl. Toll was Ewan's age or near it, small and quick and thin, in a way that wasn't the ordinary thinness of the sprawl, but something older and deeper, hunger that had gotten into the bones young and stayed. His clothes were mended past the point where the original cloth could be identified. He knew, or claimed to know, every inch of the sprawl, and over the weeks that followed, Ewan never once caught him wrong. His story came out gradually, in the flat, unbothered voice the sprawl's children used for their own catastrophes. Family from the city proper, once. Real city folk, with papers and a trade. The trade lost, the papers worthless, the slide out through the bronze gates when Toll was 4, his father dead in a street fight over a debt when he was 7. His mother coughing herself out of the world by inches, the consumption taking 3 years to do what it did. Since then, alone, a bunk in a rack house when he could pay for it. One of the long dormitory barns where the poorest of the sprawl rented a plank and a blanket by the night. Stacked 4 high, hundreds to a room, and a doorway when he couldn't. It's not so bad, Toll said, when Ewan didn't manage to hide his face in time. Rack house is warm. Bodies heat it. You want to be 3rd rack up. Too high for the rats, too low for the smoke. He shrugged and grinned his quick grin. Everything's got a right spot, if you know where. That's the whole secret of everything. Ewan walked home that evening past the graves under the flagstones and the fire in the great kitchen hearth, and the dog sprawled in a heap of warm fur, and he thought about a boy alone on the 3rd rack up, and something in his chest set quietly, like mortar, into a decision he didn't say out loud yet. And Damien went west. Every morning, while Ego turned east toward the gates and the city, Damien and the dogs went the other way, out through the thinning edges of the sprawl to where the shanties gave up at last, and the land rose into scrub hills, rough, folded country, too steep and dry to farm, too poor to fence, and so left to rabbits and birds and one boy from Blackdown with 6 dogs and a bow. It was the best part of everyone's day, though only Damien and the dogs knew it. Out there, the sprawl's noise fell away behind them, and the dogs could be what they were. Rabbit coursed the hillsides like a thrown spear. Grinner worked the brush in a pincer they'd invented themselves and refined every week. Sage kept always to Damien's left hand, and Bud to his right, and the bitch ranged ahead, vast and deliberate, reading the wind the way George read streets. They brought home rabbits mostly. Sometimes birds, sometimes eggs, sometimes autumn greens and mushrooms from the damp folds of the hills. Damien had learned the safe ones from a forager woman at the market's edge in exchange for a hare. And he never guessed, never once, because Bones had told him what dying of the wrong mushroom looked like, in detail, over supper. He explored as the fall deepened. North along the hills to where they broke into ravines. South to where the scrub ran down toward the sea cliffs and the wind never stopped. He learned the edges of the city the way George was learning its heart, and he found things out there, old boundary stones sunk in the grass, a ring of standing rocks no taller than his knee that the dogs would not enter. Once the crumbled foundation of a watchtower so ancient that even Bones, when told of it, only shrugged and said the hills had belonged to somebody before Bannock, and it hadn't ended well because it never did. But mostly it was this: a boy and 5 dogs in the high brown grass under a wide autumn sky, working together in the near silence of a pack that knows itself, while the greatest city in the world smoked and roared away at their backs, unable for a few hours each day to touch them at all. The first month turned. The nights sharpened toward winter. And on an evening like any other, with rabbit stew in the pot and the fire high, the family gathered in the great kitchen without anyone having planned it. Ego mending a boot, Bones half asleep in the good chair he'd claimed by right of age and volume, Ewan frowning over the anatomy book, George cross-legged by the window doing whatever it was George did when he stared at nothing, Damien on the floor in a drift of dogs. "We should get more bowls," Damien said, apropos of nothing. "Real ones, that match." Ego looked up. "What's wrong with the bowls?" "Nothing's wrong with them. Damien shrugged, suddenly embarrassed. "People who live somewhere have bowls that match. That's all." Nobody laughed. The fire cracked. Outside, the Sprawl muttered its endless mutter, and the wind came down off the mountains they'd crossed a lifetime of weeks ago and found the new door solid and the shutters fast. "Bowls," Ego said at last, gravely, as if adding it to a ledger. "Fine. When the rent's seen to. Bowls." It was, all of them understood without saying so, the finest thing anyone had said all month. None of them noticed, not even George, whose attention was on older things, the two men who had stood that afternoon at the mouth of the alley, watching Damien come home from the hills with the dogs flowing around him. Watching one dog in particular, the vast grey brindle bitch with the scarred shoulders and the patient, terrible eyes. Men who had been to the north once, men who knew a black-down mastiff when they saw one, men who even now were making their way toward the dog pits on the Sprawl's southern edge to sell what they had seen to a man called Red Eye.